Spending one more day on John Calvin, and that is today. I looked briefly with you at his life yesterday, and so we won't cover that anymore, but just some points that are connected to his thought. So I'd like to focus on that with you a little bit. If I were to ask you, you hear the name John Calvin, and you think of the theology of John Calvin, what first comes to mind? Anybody? What's the first thing that pops to mind? Sydney?
The 5 points of Calvin.
Okay, you think of the 5 points of Calvin, certainly. That's pretty well known. Megan?
His notion of predestination.
His whole notion of predestination. That's good. What else? Sydney?
I know he had a company or a synthesis view of the sacrament with Swingley.
Okay. His view of the sacraments. Very good. Excellent. Anything else pop to mind? These, I think, are all points that people, if they know anything about Calvin at all, they'll know, first of all, that he's connected with the idea of predestination. That's usually what everybody knows. They might have heard of the 5 points of Calvin. You all have, of course. If they've had a little bit more education, they'll know something about his distinct view of the sacraments. Anything beyond that any of you can think of? I just made mention yesterday of something else where he was something of a innovator, contributor in the history of thought. It's his whole political philosophy, his notion of representation. We take this for granted. Nobody had ever taken it for granted up until Calvin. I think this is a point where probably Calvin doesn't get the credit he deserves. You know, we in our American system of government just understand that we are governed by representatives. And that whole idea of having people who are representing others, while it had been kicked around by prior thinkers, even going clear back to Aristotle, nobody had ever really tried to do it as a practical matter until Calvin. Calvin really was pretty important in that respect. Anything else? The other point where Calvin is a bit of an innovator is in his theory of the church. It's related, not quite the same thing. So let me just talk a little bit about some of these. I invade some of your real estate here. Yes, I'll rent that from you. On the question of the sovereignty of God, predestination, that whole way of doing theology, Calvin contributed virtually nothing. All right, so just get that in your minds. He added virtually nothing. Augustine had already pretty much said it all. Luther was very much in accord with Augustine. That tradition was represented, restated certainly by Calvin. Maybe Calvin systematized it some. Kind of put it together in more of a sort of systematic theology, but in terms of adding new information, this is one point where he is not an innovator. Nor is he particularly distinct among the reformers. They all more or less shared the same outlook. Zwingli took this view. John Knox took this view. The Puritans took this view. So my point is that Calvin is simply one of many who is involved in a commitment to this very robust kind of predestinarian theology. It had been dormant since Augustine. And we've looked at that already, right? We saw the Pelagian controversy, and we saw all of that and realized that the church really didn't land anywhere exactly. It just sort of let the issue hang until we get to the time of the Reformation. But what Calvin did do on this point which was a bit of an innovation, is he extended the idea of God being sovereign outside of what you might call a religious sphere. So the idea that God is sovereign in our salvation was clearly taught by Luther, Augustine, but Calvin began to expand the notion of sovereignty to other aspects of life. Is he sovereign in our politics? Is he sovereign in how we do art? Is he sovereign in how we do economics? Is he sovereign at the point of how we run our families, you know? So it's more the authority of God extended into other areas of life. That's where you might say Calvin does add something to the mix. And in that connection you get this little phrase, which was famous in Calvin, the crown rights of King Jesus. And there's this symbol, you may have seen it, it's associated with this time. It's a crown. I don't know if I can draw one very well. With a cross in it. You ever seen that symbol? I've drawn it very poorly, but in some churches you'll see that. It's just one of the symbols that you'll sometimes find. A crown and a cross. And that is really something you trace back to Calvin, and it's the idea that Jesus is king. He ascended after his crucifixion and resurrection. He said to his disciples, all authority is given unto me. Go disciple the nations. And from that point on, the church has been in the business of bringing nations under the sovereignty of the crown rights of King Jesus. So that's a Calvinistic phrase that more or less extends beyond, it's not just predestination so much, but the whole notion of God being sovereign in every aspect of life. Okay. The Puritans, of course, took that very seriously. And in some ways, the New England experiment was an attempt to do politically the implications of that proposition theologically. Okay, fair enough? Everybody awake? Here? Good, all right. Second, one thing that is not on our list, but let me just mention it to you, is a little contribution at the point of the doctrine of Christ. He gave us the term munus triplex. Term you've often used, of course. Frequently refer to it when you're eating lunch over in the lunchroom. Halfway through a sandwich, what do you think of that munus triplex business? It's great, yeah. Any idea? You ever heard this term before? I don't know if I've mentioned it to you before. Is this new? Nicole, you ever heard this? Sarah? Munus triplex? Sydney? Josiah?
Come on.
Come on, man. No? Josiah won't even bite on it. Anybody? Jacob? Never heard it? All right. Can anybody parse this word? What if you just had to try to take it apart and say, what's the basic meaning of that word, munus triplex? Anybody want to take a shot at it? Josiah, thank you.
Does munus mean world?
Munus, it's the root of it like municipality.
Yes.
Has more to do with a kind of administration or authority. How about that part? Triplex. What's a triplex?
Tri means three.
Three?
Plex or triplex. There's three. Oh, it's three spheres. The spheres of government, church, and.
Oh, that's very good. That's very almost got it. Yeah. Yeah, you're thinking of like government, family, and church, or something like that. Good thought. Good thought. That's not it, but it should have been it. That's very good. This is more a discussion of the nature of Christ, and it's what he called the threefold offices of Christ. You all are familiar with this. You've all heard of the munus triplex, even if you haven't heard the term. If I were to ask you what are the great three offices held by Christ, he is the blank, blank, and blank. And we would say he is, what would they be? Everybody? Jordan? The great offices of Christ? He is blank, blank, and blank. No? No. Jacob? Christ is? No? Anybody? Stephen? Okay, all right, here it is. You all know, you've all heard it. He is prophet, comma, what else? Priest and king. Prophet, priest, and king. When Calvin organizes his theology of Christ, he organizes it in those three categories. Christ is first of all prophet. That is, he is the voice of God to us. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Word of God to us. That's the prophetic side of Christ. Christ is revealer. He's priest. He's the Word of us to God. See, he's the one that goes before God on our behalf. So you see, those are, in a sense, reciprocal. Prophet, God to us. Priest, us to God. King, sort of uniting those two, representing he is our king, but he has the very authority of God in his person. He is the king. And so Calvin really works with those three ideas, and from that point on, that's been classic Christology. No one had ever quite said it that way until Calvin. Now nobody says it any other way except that way since Calvin. So this is a point where, again, he gave us something distinct. He's an innovator here, in other words. Not so much here, very much here. In his view of the sacraments, let's hold that for a second. You all know the 5 points, right? Calvin, you've all got this. You can just tick these off. Don't need to spend any time on this. So Joe, if I said just give us quickly the 5 points of Calvin, bing, 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 you would say they're built on the little acrostic that is the word. Tulip, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's total depravity.
Total depravity, you all got that? If you know it, you don't need to write it down. If you don't know it, write it down. You need to know it. U is?
Unlimited something.
It's unlimited something, is neither one is right. U is, what is it? What is U?
Unconditional election.
Thank you. Unconditional election. Calvin would say that because we are totally depraved, we will never, ever, ever choose him. So the only way that we ever get saved is he chooses us. Unconditional. Not conditioned on our choice or our virtue or any other movement of the individual human. We respond, we don't initiate, according to Calvin. L would be what? Spencer, what is the L here?
L is limited atonement.
Limited atonement. Charles Spurgeon, the great English evangelist who was a strong Calvinist, didn't like this, and he preferred to call it definite atonement. But it's the same idea. The atonement of Christ was precisely for those whom he chose. The word limited sounds a little insulting to Christ, like he couldn't quite pull it off, It was a valiant effort, but it was a limited atonement. That's not really the flavor of it. It's rather that the atonement of Christ definitely applies to those whom he chose. Jacob, what's the I?
That's irresistible grace.
Correct. Irresistible grace. Meaning, according to Calvin, that grace changes your heart, in a sense, making Christ irresistibly attractive to you. It's not irresistible in the sense that God grabs you by the neck, hauls you into heaven, kicking and screaming. You didn't want to go to heaven. You wanted to go to hell. That's where all your friends are. But no, you won the cosmic roulette. You're going to spend eternity singing boring hymns when you'd rather be there in hell. You see, meantime, there's people in hell who really wanted to go to heaven. Oh, they'd love to be in heaven, but too bad their number didn't pop up in the great casino of God's sovereignty, and so they lost out. That's what people sometimes think of with irresistible grace. That would be not just a distortion, that would be a complete blasphemous misrepresentation of Calvin's view. He would say we all, by nature, want to be in hell. God changes our hearts so that we want Christ. And he does it so that Christ becomes irresistible to us. Hence, irresistible grace. P is for what? You know, Kaylee? P.
Perseverance of the saints.
Thank you. Perseverance of the saints. Did Calvin ever hear of the 5 points of Calvin? Answer, no. No. These were worked out long after his death. Does anyone know the story, how the 5 points of Calvin, I think we covered this in Doctrine or somewhere along the way. How did the 5 points of Calvin come to be formulated? Do you know?
Well, they were actually against Calvinism.
Yeah.
And it was at the Council of Dort.
That's right. Thank you. Very good. Holland, 1600s, a group called the Remonstrants, led by a fellow named Jacob Arminius, kind of a humanist scholar, objected to his Calvinist training. The Dutch reformed, instruction he'd received, and he raised 5 points of protest. And they just turned out to be what eventually became the 5 points of Calvin. So oddly enough, ironically, Arminians gave Calvinists their 5 points. You know, didn't intend to do that, I'm sure, but that's the way it worked out. All right. Excuse me for a second. Okay, let's. We've talked a little bit about this already. I had intended to have a little handout for you. I sent it over to the printer to be printed out, and then I was told just a few minutes ago that the stapler in our big deal printer over in the office is not stapling, and so it is not printing either. Any print job that asked to be stapled, and I asked it to be stapled, so it didn't print. So I don't have it for you, but it is a short essay by a theologian named Lorraine Bettner, in which he really makes this argument that it's Calvinism that gave us our notions of representative government that we have incorporated in American governmental theory. And he's the one, among others, who said, therefore, Calvin was something like the inventor of America. But unfortunately, I don't have that article for you. I will have it sooner or later, but not today. But I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly with you is the whole view of the sacrament. I said we'd come back to this. This is where I want to do it. So let me just remind you of the various options that were here. Where we had on the one hand kind of the tradition you'd find in the Quakers. Over here, a tradition more typical of the Roman Catholic Church. Then you've got intermediate positions. The position that would be here, kind of heading toward Roman Catholicism, would be the position represented by Luther. Is that what you were saying? Over here, this position would be represented by, the name here would be, Sydney? Zwingli. And I said at the colloquy of Marburg, Calvin's position was not represented. So it was really a debate between these two views, the Zwinglian view here and the Lutheran view here. And of course, Zwingli was arguing for what's called the memorial view. You know, that the sacrament is strictly intended to remind us of the work of Christ. And it has some benefit to us in doing that, but that's really all that's going on. It is strictly symbolic. You know. And Luther just couldn't quite get there. He believed that there's something more profound happening, that Christ is in some sense more present in the sacrament than that Zwinglian view contemplated. But he couldn't quite articulate it. He couldn't give his justification for that. He just insisted. It was like a gut feeling that he would not let go of. And so you got this kind of almost frustration on Luther's part, where his only response to Zwingli is finally just to kind of pound the table, hoc est corpus meum, you know, that idea. Well, The colloquy of Marburg took place in the year, by the way, I have to correct your notes. It is the year 1529. I told you, 1530. Sidney, I raised the issue that his sources said 1529. I said to him, oh, your sources have to be wrong, but then it disturbed me later to hear that there was a contrary view, and as I went back and checked, I found out that indeed my sources were wrong, Sidney, and so I want to correct that in my notes and yours. I think when I first learned it, the guy that was teaching was just rounding off, It was around 1530, and I wrote it down dutifully enough and then never went back and, checked for the accuracy of that. So you need to be careful. So it's actually 1529. But where is John Calvin in 1529? Where is he? We just covered his life yesterday, so you have this somewhat fresh in your minds. Matthew, what's happening in the life of John Calvin in 1529?
Is he at Montague?
Probably is. He's at the law school, yeah. And so by then I think he's completed his law degree. He's continuing his studies as a classical scholar. As far as we know, he's not converted yet. That probably doesn't happen until another couple of years. So the point is, Calvin is on nobody's radar in 1529. Nobody even knows there's going to be a Calvin, And so the debate here is skipping over the view that would eventually be advocated by John Calvin. John Calvin, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, actually sets forth, this is quite remarkable because he was a fairly new Christian, but a very astute thinker, and he actually sets forth his Calvinistic perspective that really stayed pretty much the same all through the years. Certainly enriched his understanding of it and developed it, but it was a view that came to be called the real presence. It is very difficult to describe or explain. That doesn't argue against it, it may argue for it. In my experience, correct theology always brings us to the precipice of some mystery, And certainly his view has a kind of mysterious aspect to it. You can see it both in his view of baptism and of the Lord's Supper, and I'd like to treat both of them briefly here. The Calvinistic view of baptism is probably most trenchantly expressed in the Westminster Confession, chapter, I think it's 29, which is actually a Puritan production, but is thoroughly Calvinistic. And its statement on baptism is in 5 short paragraphs. But the one critical phrase that sort of captures Calvin's view is this. He says, the efficacy of baptism is not necessarily tied to the moment of its administration. Now, like I say, there's more that's stated, but that would be the most distinctive Calvinistic phrase. So, the efficacy, how do you spell efficacy? E-F-F, Sydney? How do you spell efficacy? E-F-F-I or A? I, thank you. Of baptism, not tied to moment of administration. Critical word, efficacy, which I can't spell, but with Sydney's help, I'll make it through anyway. What is efficacy? If I talk about the efficacy of something, Nicole, I'm talking about its what? The efficacy of something would be its... No idea. Avery? The efficacy of something?
Just out of context, it sounds like the meaning.
Not exactly the meaning, but that's a good thought. Sarah, the efficacy of something would be its?
Its weight, its
Sort of. That's a little closer. Megan?
the effect of that.
That's very close. That's you're gathering that from the word itself. All right. You might just say it's the efficacy would be the power of it, the strength of it. Is that what you said, Sydney? Were you? So there it is. The efficacy of something is its potency, its power. So the first thing you need to gather from this Calvinistic statement is, please get this, there is an efficacy to baptism according to Calvin. This is what separates him from Zwingli. Zwingli would say there's no efficacy. It is a memorial. It's a ritual that reminds me of the work of Christ. That's it. It's good for me to do it, but there's no intrinsic power in the sacrament itself of baptism or the Lord's Supper. Calvin says, nope. There is an energy, a power, an effect in this sacrament. But, he then says, it is not tied to the moment of its administration. Baptism has a power, but that power may not hit you at the moment that you get wet. Right? It may come before, it may come after. It may come at the moment. It's not tied to the moment of its administration. What does that mean? Well, according to Calvinistic Reformed understanding, baptism is one with an event called regeneration. So baptism and regeneration are one event, logically, but not necessarily chronologically. Baptism is the visible side, regeneration is the invisible side. You know, for example, the Catholics teach baptismal regeneration. Y'all know that? If you are baptized in a Catholic church, at the moment of your baptism, you are regenerated. Ex opere operato, happens by the working of the works. Happens every time, all the time. It's part of the power of the church, administered by the priest, and if you're baptized in a Catholic church, you are regenerated. Period. End of discussion. Luther had a notion of baptismal regeneration. It wasn't as robust as the Catholic view. He insisted there has to be faith present, either in the parents or in the one baptized. It's not automatic, but it's still a baptismal regeneration. Y'all following me here? Calvin believes baptismal regeneration. But in Calvin's view, the regeneration may take place at a time distinct from the event of baptism. Maybe before, maybe after. So you can picture it this way. This line is a timeline. You know? Maybe at a certain point along the way you're regenerated, and then at a later time you're baptized. You come to faith in Christ. Here's Augustine. He's converted in the garden. He hears the little child sing, tell the lake, tell. Read the Bible, reads it, he's convicted, he comes to faith. Later, Easter Sunday, 87, he's baptized. When he sees this event, when Augustine looks back on his life from the point of view of eternity, it will look like these are one event. They are logically one event, but chronologically could be distinct. That's Calvin's view. The Zwinglian view denies baptismal regeneration. baptism is simply a symbol. Regeneration is unconnected to it. It's a symbol of it, but not connected to it organically. And of course, the Quakers don't have sacrament. So you see, Calvin, this is the most complicated view, most subtle. But what he's saying is that from the point of view of God's working, God works through baptism, but it may not take place at the very moment of the administration of the sacrament. But in a sense, they're still one great event. Sydney.
I'm sort of confused. So would Calvin say baptism is a means of regeneration?
Well, I don't know if he put it quite that way. It's a good question, subtle question. I think he would simply say that there is one event which is a regenerative event. It has a visible side and an invisible side. The visible side is baptism. To say that you are regenerated by means of baptism, he might, in some guarded sense, allow that. I'm just not sure. It's a subtle question, but he might permit that. But he wouldn't want to simply wind up saying there's a kind of automatic cause and effect. Baptized, there'll certainly be regeneration. He doesn't say that.
Yeah. My reason for asking that is it would seem like if you're regenerated before your baptism,
Right.
that would really, at least my understanding of this view of it, would take the meaning out of the purpose of the baptism.
It doesn't take the purpose out because it's one event, and this is something Christ commands and is certainly practiced by the church and has rich significance to it. So he doesn't see any depriving of baptism of its meaning. It's like an iceberg, you know. Part of it's floating above the water, that'd be the visible baptism. The much greater event of regeneration is below the surface and visible. But in a sense, the presence of this points to the reality of that. He would say they are connected. Good question. That's a good thought. Yeah.
Would Zwingli type Christians, would they not think baptism is necessary for Christians if it's just representation?
Well, Zwingli believes Christians should be baptized. He understands the New Testament commands that that people be baptized, and so he subscribes to that. Where he differs is simply what's the meaning of this rite that's taking place. What does it mean? For Calvin, it has a richer meaning. It has more power, in a sense. For Zwingli, it's a ritual we do in obedience to Christ. And really, I think I mentioned to you the other day when we were on this topic, for Zwingli, the principal purpose of baptism is what? Did we cover this? What is baptism accomplishing, or what is it saying? Did we talk about this? Maybe we didn't. Baptism from a Zwinglian, and this, by the way, represents the Baptist tradition. So if you have a Baptist background, then this, as far as I know, would be your tradition, that baptism is more a testimony of the person being baptized. You are saying something in baptism. You come forward to be baptized, you're the one making a public declaration. You're the one announcing your faith in Christ. You're announcing that you're going to follow Christ and be his disciple and so on. Baptism is mainly your speech. Got it? Once you reach the Calvinistic view, the main person speaking in baptism is God. God speaks. You're not saying anything. God's saying something. He's marking you. He's, indicating that you belong to him. And even more so as you move down here, you find baptism becomes increasingly God's action. Here, you have this still very strong emphasis that God is speaking, but he's speaking more in terms of promise. The promise that as you have faith in Christ, you will certainly be protected from God's wrath, just as the children of Israel were protected by the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel in the Exodus. You're protected, you're guarded, by this baptismal rite. The Lord's Supper has a similar kind of mystery to it. He calls it the real presence. He wants to say Jesus is present in the sacrament, the bread and wine, in a way that is indeed unique. But not physical. So he denies the substantial presence of Christ as Luther affirmed it, but he, please get this, try to get this. He denied the substantial presence of Christ as Luther affirmed it, but he affirmed the substantial presence of Christ against Zwingli. He used the same word negatively with respect to Luther and positively with respect to Zwingli. Okay? But he meant something slightly different by substance. He meant with Zwingli that Christ is really present in the sacrament, but not physically present. Substantially present, in the sense that there's something uniquely different in this sacrament than anything else in life. We know, of course, in a sense, Jesus is present everywhere. You know, you go to a bowling alley, you go to a golf course, you go out in the back parking lot, you know Jesus is present. Jesus is present everywhere. He's God, omnipresence and all that. Is he present in some different sense in the sacrament? Zwingli would say no. Calvin would say yes. And he calls it a sacramental presence. And I don't know how to put this except to kind of illustrate it. It is, in a sense, the sacramental touch of God. Calvin says there's word and sacrament. Word is God speaking. Sacrament is God touching. I have a conversation with Stephen after class. Stephen says, "Hey, Mr. Gore, I'm going off to college. I need a car. You're driving that real hot 1992 Subaru Legacy. I wondered if I could take it off your hands." I say to myself, what an idiot. But to him I say, well, certainly, Stephen. I'd be glad to sell you this little plum, this little peach, this little wonderful car that just has brought me so much joy all through the years. You know, for the right price, I'll be glad. Because of my love and affection for you and the long-standing relationship and friendship, I'll be glad to give you this piece of junk. And so I make a deal with him. And Stephen and I sort of cook up a transaction. We could make a deal to sell my car on certain terms at a certain price simply based on a conversation. Doesn't take any writing. Doesn't take any, you don't have to reduce it to any sort of official, kind of contract. We could just do it based on a conversation. It's called an oral contract. But we would solemnize our oral contract by a sacramental act. What sacramental act might Stephen and I engage in? I know I'm coughing, but I'm not contagious, Stephen, so don't be afraid here. What sacramental act might Stephen and I engage in to solemnize our oral contract? Laura?
I was going to say shaking hands.
That's right. See? Now look at that. Look at that.
Don't break it.
That is physical touch. We human beings are sacramental. We do things that are symbolic, but very richly meaningful. I shake hands with Stephen. We touch each other. Did that change the price of the car? Jordan? Did it change the terms of the interest rate? Did anything in the oral contract change because I shook hands? Answer, no. But that touch, in a sense, sealed it, didn't it? You follow that? It gave it kind of a ballast or a weight. That's what Calvin says happens. We come to church, we hear the word preached. God promises me His blessing and so on. But then he shakes hands with me in the sacrament. He actually touches me and confirms the truth of what he has said. And that is a real thing. Does that make sense? That's kind of his spin on it. Maybe helpful to you. Laura. Yes, go ahead, right. I was just thinking that. Laura is going to distribute sacramental brownies. All right, while Laura's distributing the sacramental brownies, let me add one other. We've talked about the sovereignty of God. We've talked about munus triplex. We have not talked about Calvin on the Holy Spirit. He had a whole lot to say on that. He was a great contributor. We talked about tulip. We talked about ecclesiology. But one thing in this point, I want to add this. Calvin gave us what came to be called the marks of the true church. So it's the last thing I want to cover. Fairly well known, fairly helpful. Of course, there's a big debate in the Reformation. How do you know a true church? Calvin was saying the Catholic Church is not a true church. Catholics were saying Calvin's not a true, his church is not a true church. How do you know a true church? So Calvin gives us what are called the marks of the true church. Meaning a true visible church, not the invisible church, which is a matter of the personal heart, of a person. But how do you know a visible church is a true church? Anybody, have you ever covered this? Did we do this in doctrine? Did we do this? Okay, so this should be somewhere in your thinking. The marks are, can you think of them? Anybody? Can you think of any of the marks of the true church? We covered not that long ago in doctrine. You can't think of one of them. Oh, I'm so disappointed. But Sydney can think of one.
I think I can. Was it that they use the scripture?
Sorry, yes. So, the proper use of the scriptures. In other words, the preaching in a true church is going to be preaching that is consistent with the content of the Bible, not lots of extraneous stuff, that is not really properly part of the content of the scripture. That's the first one. Second one, Megan?
I think, isn't one godly leaders in the church?
That's part of a broader one, which we'll call church government. That a true church will have a legitimate form of government. He does not insist that it be Presbyterial. He likes Presbyterial. He thinks that's the best. But he's prepared to allow a monarchical form, such as you find in the Anglican Church, a more democratic form, such as you find in congregational churches. It's fine. He doesn't object to that. But he, for his part, would prefer a kind of Presbyterial. But you can't just have a home coffee clutch. Well, let's all have coffee and donuts, and we'll call it church, We'll read a few verses of the Bible, and that'll be it. He says, no. Church has government. Church has authority. Church has order. And so there's got to be some sort of structure to it in order for it to be a true church. All right, so we have one and we have three. What are the other two? Anybody? Jacob? Remember? What's the second one? No? Okay, we've been talking about it for most of the day today. It is? Are you going to answer this? No, hands down. Proper celebration of sacraments. Calvin would say, the Quakers disqualify themselves from being a true church because they don't follow Christ and his commands at the point of the sacraments. I'll leave to your judgment whether you agree with Calvin, but that would be his view. Sacraments have to be celebrated. Christ commands it. It's not an option. The fourth one is related to the third one, that there's some form of church discipline going on. When people depart from the proper behavior of Christian people, that there's some kind of discipline that will kick in at that point. He's not for witch hunts. He doesn't advocate going around and scrutinizing every person's life in minute detail to see if there's any little thing out of whack. But if you're living in open and notorious disobedience to the ethic of Christ, then he believes the church should step in and exercise some kind of discipline in that regard. I don't know if those brownies are going to make it around. He's hoping, I'm so sorry, I didn't make it around the room.
Yes, Josiah.
Josiah, question.
Okay. So, with talking about the marks of the true church,
Yes.
What would Calvin say about Lutherans?
He would say the Lutherans were a true church.
Okay.
Yeah. He would say he would doubt the Catholics were, not because they didn't, largely because he believed they were preaching heresy. They were heretical.
Okay. So you probably disagree on the first and second point, probably. Well, even
With respect to the Catholic,
Yeah.
he would say they're abusing the sacrament. He would say they're not really preaching the gospel. He would really doubt that the discipline of the Catholic Church was proper. Burning people at the stake is a little over the top for church discipline, that kind of thing.
basically everything.
Pardon me?
Basically everything.
Yeah, I think at all points he would have some questions about it. Right.
Guys, 45 seconds.
Okay, time's running.
Come on.
Now, my friends, once you have obtained a brownie, you are free to leave.